Good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining for our Psalms in Hebrew and Comparative Translations class. This morning, we are going to do Psalm 18. I mentioned at the end of last class that I wasn't sure if we would do all of Psalm 18 or a part of Psalm 18. And after reading through the Psalm a few times, I felt like, well, I feel like with poetry, it's very challenging to just split it. Like who am I to decide where a poem should be broken up? And also it's hard to talk about the structure and flow of the entire work of poetry if you do it over 2 weeks. So we're going to do the whole thing today, even though it is the longest one we've done so far and 51 verses. And it's hard to, we won't be able to say something about every turn of phrase or every way that the translations play with the language. Obviously, that 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 is possible when we have an 8 verse psalm, but not a 51 verse psalm. I and as you got uh the packet this morning, you'll notice it's 33 pages long, and that's, I mean, it's a hefty bit of work. So we're gonna do what we usually do, which is I'm gonna read the psalm in Hebrew. It's gonna take a little longer this time. Maybe I won't read the whole thing, but I'll definitely read selections from it. And then we're gonna look at the psalm in English in a couple of different translations, and then we're going to have an opportunity to discuss some of the liturgical connections and some of the spiritual applications of the psalm. And that's where I hope to spend most of our time, on liturgical connections and spiritual applications. But I do want to say about this psalm that some of our psalms that we've looked at so far, almost all of the psalms that we've looked at so far, the book of Psalms wants us to imagine that they are part of David's life. Like, we're going to get to a point where the Psalms, even if they're attributed to David, are not sort of connected deeply to his biography. But we are still in a part of the book of Psalms where the way that the compiler of this book is trying to get us to think of is that these psalms have specific connections to David's life. This psalm, Psalm 18, is like more like that than any other psalm basically that we've looked at or probably will look at. This psalm is the one where even scholars who say, oh, the psalms are attributed to David, but they weren't written by David, this psalm, there is reasonable, I mean, you can't prove it, obviously, but there's a reasonable idea to think that David actually wrote this one himself. And the really long superscription in what is in Hebrew verse 1, Lamenatseach for the conductor, Le'eved Adonai for the servant of God, David of David, Asher Diber Ladonai, which David spoke to God at Divrei Ashira Azot, the words of this song, B'yom Hitzil Adonai Oto Mikaf Kol Evav Umiyad Shaul. Right, this is the song of praise that David said at a specific exact moment in David's biography when God saved David from all of his enemies and from the hand of Saul. And this psalm appears almost exactly the same as the 22nd chapter of the book of 2 Samuel. And it is in that context one of our haftarot, one of our we don't read the version from the book of Psalms. We read the version from the book of 2 Samuel. But that passage, which is almost identical to this passage, is one of the haftarot that we read. That is one of our liturgical readings of book selection from the prophets that we engage with. And I forgot to look up which Torah portion it's connected to, but I can definitely do that. Anyway, so what I wanted to say about this is this psalm appears in Tanakh twice. Once in the middle of a narrative, and once here in the book of Psalms. And in the narrative, it actually appears at a specific point in David's narrative. So unlike other Psalms where we're sort of saying, maybe David said it at this time in his life, or maybe David said it at this time in his life. Like, this actually comes from a specific exact moment in David's life. So that is an interesting and important context for the psalm. All right, so we'll read in Hebrew. Lamenatzeach levet Adonai leDavid asher diber l'Adonai et divrei hashira azot b'yom hitzil Adonai oto mikaf kol oivav umiyad Shaul. Vayomar. Oh, I wanted to say that the scholars think that the Book of Samuel version of this is the original, and that the Book of Psalms version is a later edited version. It's very, very, very close. It's almost word for word. But there are some places where you can tell that it's been sort of edited and brought up to date with like later Hebrew. And that's how they think that the original is from the Book of 2 Samuel. Yeah, Mishka.
Can you just screen share?
Yeah. That I can. Vayomar Erchamcha Adonai Chizki Adonai Sali Umitzudati Umufalti Elai Tsuri Echesebo Magini V'Keren Yishi Miskabi Meula Lekra Adonai Umin Oivai Ivashea Afafuni Chevle Mavet V'Nachale B'Liyal Yivatuni Chevle Sheol Sevavuni Kidmuni Moshke Mavet Batzar li ekra Adonai ve'el Elohai ashavea yishma mehechalo koli v'shavati lefanav tavo be'oznav v'tigash v'tirash haaretz u'mosadei harim yirgazu v'yitgashu ki charalo Allah ashan ba'po v'ish mipiv tochel gechalim ba'aru mimenu v'yet shamayim v'yirad ba'rafel tachat raglav. So if you know some Hebrew, you can hear that a lot of this psalm is in the singular voice. This happened to me. I'm explaining my experience, right? And so David is talking about his specific enemies, right? Some of the psalms have been more general about enemies pursuing someone, but here this is a description of a personal experience. I'm gonna skip toward the end. Pick up here. Ha'el ha'me'azreini chayil vayitain tamim darki mishaveh raglai kayalot v'albamotai ya'amideni melamed yadai lamilchama v'nichata keshet nechusha zerotai v'titain li magen yishecha v'mincha tisadeni v'anvatcha tarbeni tarchiv tzadi tachtai v'lo ma'adu karsulai erdof oivai v'asigem v'lo ashov ad kalotam em chatzem v'lo yuchlu kum yiplu tachat raglai v'tazreini chayil lamilchama tachria kamai tachtai Ve'oivai natata li oref u'mesanai atzmitem yishavu ve'ein moshia al Adonai ve'lo anam ve'esh chakem ka'afar al pnei ruach ketit chutzot arikem tifalteni merivei am tisimeni lerosh goyim am lo yadati yavduni Leshema ozen yishamu li b'nei nechar yichachashu li b'nei nechar yibolu v'yachgeru mimisgero tehem. Hai Adonai uvaruch tzuri yarum Elohei yishi ha'el hanoten nekamot li v'yadaber amim tachtai mifalti me'oevai af min yikamai tiromameni meish hamas tatzileni. Al keino decha bagoyim Adonai l'shimcha zamera magdil yeshuot malko ve'osa chesed b'imshicho l'David u'zaro ad olam. All right, so that's the psalm in Hebrew. I'm going to read one of the translations, and then we'll get some comments.
Just a question.
Yeah.
The acrostic sense, it's got a little arrow. Does that have a particular meaning?
The acrostic sense.
Um,
I don't know what you're talking about.
Mem, nun, just
Oh, those are just that's the number of the verse.
okay.
Aleph is 1, Yud Aleph is 11, Kaf Aleph is 21,
Okay.
Lamed Aleph 31. There are 51 verses. Nun Aleph 51.
Okay, I always get confused with numbers.
Yeah. I did want to say, the Jewish Publication Society, JPS, has there's what's called the old JPS translation, that's 1917. There's a new JPS translation that's from 1985. And this year, 2023, the JPS put out a brand new revised JPS translation, which is JPS 2023. That's called RJPS as opposed to O or NJPS. The RJPS translation is the JPS Tanakh gender sensitive edition. It is the revised JPS, and it is wonderful. And instead of using the 1985 version, which I was using last spring because this hadn't come out yet, I'm now using the 2023 version of the JPS translation. For the leader. Oh, and so whenever they're translating the name Adonai, like Adonai, Yud He Vav He, which in previous JPS translations was translated as Lord, in this translation, it's translated as God with all caps most of the time. But any other name of God that is also all caps is also a translation of the word Adonai, Yud He Vav He. So, and the eternal is another translation. And so there are sometimes, especially in poetry, where they use eternal instead of God. Eternal is a good translation of Yud He Vav He because Yud He Vav He is a form of the word of the verb to be, which is a conjunction of the words for was, is, and will be. So eternal is very much connected to that idea of was, is, will be. And so anything that's a name of God that's in all caps in this translation is a translation of Adonai. And then if it says God with not all caps, that's a translation of the word El, which means God, or Elohim, which means God. There are other names for God that are not the Yud He Vav He name, and those are like capital G-O-D as opposed to all caps. Okay. And there are a lot of things about this gender sensitive translation that are really beautiful, and maybe at some point I will do a standalone class that's not that'll just be on the updates that the JPS that the Jewish Publication Society has done to their translation, so that anyway, it's very cool. All right, let's read Psalm 18. For the leader of David, the servant of God, who addressed the words of this song to God after God had saved him from the hands of all his enemies and from the clutches of Saul. He said, I adore you, O Eternal One, my strength, O Eternal One, my crag, my fortress, my deliverer, my God, my rock in which I take shelter, my shield, my mighty champion, my haven. All praise. I called on God and was delivered from my enemies. Ropes of death encompassed me. Torrents of Belial terrified me. Ropes of Sheol encircled me. Snares of death confronted me. In my anguish, I called on the Eternal, cried out to my God, who from heavenly abode heard my voice, whose ears received my cry. Then the earth rocked and quaked. The foundations of the mountains shook, rocked by divine indignation. Smoke went up from God's nostrils, devouring fire from God's mouth, live coals blazing forth. God bent the sky and came down, thick cloud beneath divine feet. God mounted a cherub and flew, gliding on the wings of the wind. God made darkness a screen, pavilions of dark thunderheads, dense clouds of the sky all around. In the divine brilliance, hail and fiery coals pierced those clouds. Then God thundered from heaven. The Most High gave forth voice, hail and fiery coals, letting shafts fly and scattering them, discharging lightning and routing them. The ocean bed was exposed. The foundations of the world were laid bare by your mighty roaring, O Eternal One, at the blast of your breath. Reaching down from on high, God took me, drawing me out of the mighty waters, rescuing me from my fierce enemy, from foes too strong for me. They confronted me on the day of my calamity, but God was my support, bringing me out to freedom, pleased with me enough to rescue me. God rewarded me according to my merit, requiting the cleanness of my hands, for I have kept to the ways of God, and have not been guilty before my God, for I am mindful of all God's rules, and have not disregarded God's laws. I have been blameless toward God, and have guarded myself against sinning, and God has requited my merit, according to the evident cleanness of my hands. With the loyal you deal loyally, with the blameless blamelessly, with the pure you act purely, and with the perverse you are wily. It is you who deliver lowly folk, but haughty eyes you humble. It is you who light my lamp. My eternal God lights up my darkness. With you I can rush a barrier. With my God I can scale a wall. The way of God is perfect. The word of the Eternal is pure. God shields all who seek refuge. Truly, who is a God except the Eternal? Who is a rock but our God? The God who girded me with might, who made my way secure, who made my legs like a deer's, and set me firmly on the heights, who trained my hands for battle. My arms can bend a bow of bronze. You have granted me the shield of your protection. Your right hand has sustained me. Your care has made me great. You have let me stride on freely. My feet have not slipped. I pursued my enemies and overtook them. I did not turn back till I destroyed them. I struck them down and they could rise no more. They lay at my feet. You have girded me with strength for battle, brought low my adversaries before me, made my enemies turn tail before me. I wiped out my foes. They cried out, but there was none to deliver, to God who did not answer them. I ground them fine as windswept dust. I trod them flat like dirt of the streets. You have rescued me from the strife of people. You have set me at the head of nations. Peoples I knew not must serve me. At the mere report of me, they are submissive. Foreign peoples cower before me. Foreign peoples lose courage and come trembling out of their strongholds. God lives. Blessed is my rock. Exalted be God, my deliverer, the God who has vindicated me and made people subject to me, who rescued me from my enemies and raised me clear of my adversaries, saved me from lawless opposition. For this I sing your praise among the nations, Eternal One, and hymn your name, according great victories to your King, keeping faith with your anointed, with David and his offspring evermore. So I usually ask, what emotional reactions do you have to this psalm? What feeling does it give you? Larry, you are muted if you're, yeah. Gary,
Nothing,
yeah.
nothing changes.
Nothing changes. Tell me more about that.
Well, if you look at recent history, what's happening even today, the violence, the intensity, the persistence, the appeals, They're the same emotionally.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the things that we started that came up also in last week's conversation was the way in which last spring it was very easy to read the accounts of enemies and to think of them as internal enemies rather than external enemies. And that in the moment currently, for many of us, it feels like external enemies are a more lived reality than they have been in the recent past. Gary.
I was gonna actually say something pretty similar. This one sounded more like a big battle than some of the other some of the other Psalms. And I was really struck by what seems like a more direct experience with God, like in verse 9 and so on.
So, like smoke went up from God's nostrils, devouring fire
Yeah.
from God's mouth. Yeah. So that feels like such a visceral experience of God. Yeah. Mishka.
Visceral, I'm thinking visual. There's a sense that of love for God, that there is a sense that that David sees God, that God is real, has very much anthropomorphic features, and as such, David has a real relationship with God, and so trust is a real important piece. The sense that God is very, very real, both in his dialogue, and God is doing X, Y, and Z, and in a kind of active voice, and then in a more passive voice at the end of the psalm. Whoever is writing is talking about the effect of that relationship, that because there is that relationship, God then acts against the enemy on behalf of David.
Certainly, David experiences his victory in battle, repeated victories in battle. When you read the chapter right before this song, this is Psalm 18, but it's the same as 2 Samuel 22. When you read 2 Samuel 21, it's battle after battle after battle. In that chapter, there are like 8 different battles against the various enemies of David, and he takes them all out. And also in that chapter, the enemies have stolen the bones of Saul and Jonathan, who were killed in a previous chapter, and that, David is the king. But you still can't let the previous king's bones be taken by enemies of Israel. So he gets the bones back and he buries them formally. And then in chapter 22, he gives this psalm, this song of praise, of deliverance. So yeah, it's a lot of different battles.
You also get the sense of continuity, persistence. He didn't just, because he's in trouble, reach out to God. He has been in a relationship with God, and he sees God in the works of nature as just an extension of God, and which leads to the next psalm. It's a wonderful prelude to
Psalm 19.
The 19th Psalm. Yeah.
Yeah.
That God is there. He is everything you see is God. You are swimming in God. Have a continuing relationship with God.
Right. Definitely David feels like God is is present for him in his righteousness and in his relationship with God. So one thing that I noticed about this psalm in terms of its emotional tenure is there are many psalms that we've looked at that express the sense of being out of control or in dire straits. But this psalm is the emotional feeling of this psalm is the emotions of a person who has recently been delivered from dire straits. This is not a person who is still this is a person who has schmeiced the enemy. It is not a person who is still engaged, right? This is a psalm with the emotions of vindication and thanksgiving and triumph and a felt certainty of continued divine connection and providence, right? Like, God is with me. God has always been with me. God helped me defeat my enemies. I pursued them and destroyed them utterly. They are gone, right? That is a very different from the previous several psalms that we've looked at, where the enemies seem more powerful than David. Yeah. So did other people feel that sense too?
Definitely. But I keep thinking, coming back to Bob Dylan's song, God is on our side.
Mm-hmm.
Because this psalm is definitely part of that. The problem that Dylan brings up is the other side might be equally so adamant.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a beautiful connection. Yeah, right? Like, we're if God's on your side, does that there are a lot of sins that can be glossed over because of a sense of divine providence.
I'm reading a biography of sorts of the philosopher Wittgenstein and his interaction with Bertrand Russell and an ethicist called Moore. And we're at the point of World War I. And Wittgenstein leaves England to fight on German's side. And his friends are too old to fight at Oxford and Cambridge, but there's an example when both sides in foxholes are saying this psalm or hoping this psalm.
He also, though, in verse 25 and forward, he's saying God is with everybody, not just me because I've been close to God. It's to the loyal, you show yourself loyal, to the pure, pure, but skillful in your dealings with the perverse. You bring humble to safety, but humiliate those who make themselves high and mighty. So he's not saying God only attends to my side. God's on both sides, but watch yourself, because God pays attention and deals with you as you deserve.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. So let's look at some of the liturgical connections. So I will say this is a very long psalm, and there weren't that many liturgical, but there are more than in many psalms, but only because of the length. But it's not like we use this psalm regularly in our liturgical practice. But I will just say I did already say that, we do read a very close version of this psalm as a haftarah. And so we do read it in that sense. All right, so verse 4 is verse 4 of our psalm is the first verse of an anthology of 5 verses that is used on Simchat Torah in the Sephard Jewish community, with the themes of kingship, and it's 5 verses that begin that the first letter of each verse begins with the letters that spell out the word malchut, which means kingship. So mem, lamed, chaf, vav, taf. And so the first verse in that is from Psalms 18:4, which with praises I call upon the Lord, from my foes I will be saved. Right? Mihulal ekra Adonai umin oivai ivashea. So mihulal is our mem verse, and I think it's helpful to see it in its whole anthology. So, with praises I call upon the Lord, from my foes I will be saved. Forever, O Lord, your word stands in the heavens. For your kindness toward me is great. You have saved me from the depths of Sheol, but I am like a thriving olive tree in God's house. I trust in the kindness of God forever and ever. You have heard the entreaty of the lowly, O Lord. May you make their hearts firm. May you incline your ear. So actually, in thinking about this, the word that it spells out is malchut, kingship, but the concept is concepts of salvation and trust and connection to God, and so it almost is like a retelling of what divine sovereignty is, right? If you think of these 5 verses as describing divine sovereignty, but they don't seem to have anything to do with divine kingship at all, and so the person who's anthologizing these psalms is making a point about what sovereignty could be. Now, we don't use this particular anthology in our synagogue, but it is an interesting connection. So one of the things that's very interesting about this isn't the first anthology that we've looked at of verses from Psalms that have been recast into its own different poem. And I think that's an interesting facet of Jewish prayer that you can take these verses from disparate psalms and interweave them, and then they make their own new psalm. All right, so the last clause of verse 8, Vayitgashu ki charalo, that is quoted in a liturgical poem designed specifically to be read on the Shabbat before Purim. And it's from the Sidur Edot HaMizrach, which is the text of the Sidur used by like Moroccan Jews, and the Shabbat before Purim, Shabbat Zachor, is a Shabbat which specifically is about God's deliverance of the people, and God's promise of continued aid in destroying the Amalekites, the evil people in every generation. And so the poem says, Yom tzeit paro acharai, litrof karye adarai, nitzvu kachoma meme mibsarai, misparai, vayitgashu ki charalo. So clearly the poem has meter and it rhymes. And then the last section of the poem is a quote from our psalm. And this is one stanza of a longer piece that talks about a lot of different enemies of Israel that have come, and then uses different verses from Psalms as the fourth stick of each of these stanzas. So I translated, on the day Paro came out after me to tear apart my flock like a lion, the waters of my breakers stood forth like a wall, rocked by divine indignation. So that was my attempt to translate. But rocked by divine indignation is the quote from our psalm. So it's interesting to sort of think about this particular use of verse 8, because in the context of verse 8, it's a description of kind of an earthquake, right? The earth shivered and quivered, the bases of the mountains shake, they shivered because God is furious. They reeled and rocked the earth. Then the foundations of the mountains quaked and reeled, for it kindled in him, in God, meaning, right? Like God has this sense of fire and indignation, right? He heard from his palace my voice. Nope, that's not the right one. The earth heaved and shuddered. The mountain's foundations were shaken. They heaved, for smoke rose from his nostrils, and the fire from his mouth consumed. Coals blazed up around him. That's the original context. But here, it's this idea of rocked by divine indignation. The sense is not that the waters are rocked, but that the reason why the waters have become walls to block Pharaoh from the people is because God was angry at Pharaoh. It's like it's a use of that sense of divine anger and wrath in the context of this longer poem about God protecting God's people from the enemies in different generations. And of course, Pharaoh coming out after the people is one example of an enemy, but not the only one. All right. So that's two different liturgical uses. Neither of them are in our Siddur. There is a beautiful liturgical book called Perek Shirah that's contained in some Siddurim, and one way to translate Perek Shirah is the song of the world. It imagines that every part of creation sings a song of praise to God, and it finds a verse from Tanakh that is each creature or feature of creation's song. Verse 12 of our psalm is the verse that the heavy clouds sing in praise to God. So it's avim are heavy clouds. Avim omrim yashet choshech sitro sivivotav sukato chashkat mayim ave shachakim. You can see that the word avim and ave, that's the same word. Av with an I in there is dense clouds. The dense clouds sing, God made darkness a screen, pavilions of dark thunderheads, dense clouds of the sky all around. So this is the song that dense clouds are singing. I'm just going to pull up like Perek Shirah so that we can look at it together. It's a cool thing. So here you can see Rabbi Eliezer said, anyone who involves himself with Perek Shirah in this world merits it in the world to come, as it says, and then Az Yashir Moshe. Okay, so this is just the introduction. Then chapter 1, Shamayim Omrim. So we begin with heaven and earth. Shamayim Omrim, Hashamayim Misaprim Kivod El Umasei Yadav Magid Arakia. We're gonna look at this verse again next week when we do Psalm 19. And the earth sings, LeDavid Mizmor Ladonai Haaretz Umloa Tevel Vyoshveva. Okay, from Psalm 24. The earth and everything in it is God's. And then there's another verse about the earth. And then the Garden of Eden says, and then hell, Gehinnom says, and then Midbar, the wilderness says, and then the fields say, and then the waters say, and then the seas say, and the rivers say, and the wellsprings say, day says, night says. Anyway, then we get to the thick clouds, and that's our psalm. The thick clouds say, Yashet Choshech Sitro, God made darkness a screen, or God made darkness God's secret place. So I think that's a beautiful, right? And of course, Avei Shechakim are thick, dense clouds. All right. So that's another. Also, I encourage you to read Perek Shirah. Like, it is beautiful. And it's a really nice, like, intertextual connection. So then you can look up all of the different verses. And we'll talk about Perek Shirah again next week when we get to Psalm 19. All right, so on Shabbat morning, before the first Aliyah, the Gabbai, who is guiding and correcting the Torah readers and calling up those with honors to the Torah, offers this prayer. I'm going to sing it so that for those of you who come on Shabbat morning, you might recognize it. Vayazor v'yakein v'yoshia l'chol ha'chosim bo v'nomar amen. Hakol havugad unu kavod Torah yamod. Right? So right before you call up the first Aliyah, you offer this prayer, and it means, may you help shield and save all those who trust in you, and let us say amen. So the idea of a shield for all those who trust in God comes from the second half of verse 31. Verse 31 says, God shields all those who seek refuge, right? God is a magen l'chol hachosim bo. Now, I really don't know why they translated this as trust in God, as opposed to who seek refuge in God. The Koren Sak Sidur translates it as seek refuge. I don't know why our Sidur changed it from seek refuge to trust. The word is not trust in Hebrew. It doesn't say botchim. It says chosim. So it seems like maybe a mistake, but I don't know. I mean, or maybe they like just picked a translation that they like. It's very like, anyway, but and certainly the idea of God helping those who trust in God that's not a made up idea. There are other verses that have that word botchim. Anyway, so that is a liturgical use of this psalm that we in fact use in our synagogue every Shabbat morning. And now you'll be able to think, when you hear the words kol hachosimbo, the yagen l'chol hachosimbo, that is a direct allusion to Psalm 18, and you can think about what it means that we're invoking this idea about seeking refuge in God in the context of this psalm of praise for God's salvation. All right. Next liturgical connection. If you're a regular to our Shabbat morning service, you know the hymn Ein Kelohenu, there is none like God, which we sing toward the end of the service. Ein Kelohenu, right? However, in our conservative Siddur, that hymn is actually mostly removed from its original context. Have you ever wondered why that hymn ends with a reference to the fragrant incense offered by our ancestors? Like, why do you think it ends with Atahu sheiktiru avotenu at korbanot, right? Like the that line at the end seems so incongruous in the way that we use that the Ein Kelohenu psalm, right? It's a hymn, but we left in the last line, which is really an introduction. The whole hymn is an introduction to a passage that isn't in our Siddur, but is in most Orthodox Siddurs, that describes the composition of the daily incense offering. And so the reason why Ein Kelohenu ends with that reference to the incense is because then the next thing that you're supposed to say is you describe the composition of the incense. I'm just going to read that to you a little bit. The incense mixture consisted of balsam, onycha, galbanum, and frankincense, each weighing 70 manez, myrrh, cassia, spikenard, and saffron, each weighing 16 manez, 12 manez of costus, 3 of aromatic bark, 9 of cinnamon, 9 cobs of carcina lye, 3 sayas, and 3 cobs of cypress wine. If cypress wine was not available, old white wine might be used. A quarter of a cob of Sodom salt, and a minute amount of smoke-raising herb. I'm just saying, like, I understand why we took that passage out. Like, we don't need to continue reciting the recipe for the incense that was offered in the temple. Although many Jews continue to recite that recipe to this day. Well, what has always bugged me is why we didn't also take out what we use as our last line of that hymn, but that is really the introduction to that passage. Like, why do we leave in the line, "You are God to whom our ancestors offered the fragrant incense"? We could just remove that line, and then we wouldn't have this like weird allusion to something that we don't actually do. Anyway,
maybe the phrase is incense itself.
right. I mean, I think that's why we read that paragraph, is because the prayers are supposed to replace the sacrifices.
Right.
But we don't offer the incense anymore, but we can study the texts about them. And that's the idea, is that the sacrifices become Torah study, and we read the passages of the sacrifices, including the incense, and then we study Torah about them, right? The next bit is the rabbis who are discussing this, right? Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel says balsam refers to the sap that drips from the balsam tree. The carcina lye was used for bleaching the onycha to improve it. The cypress wine was used to soak the onycha in it to make it pungent, right? Like, the rabbis are discussing it. That's the next section that we're supposed to read. Anyway, so yeah, I mean, I get it. Like, honestly, I could understand why we would read it. And I also understand why they took it out. I don't understand why they didn't take out that other line. But it turns out that actually the Ein Kelohenu prayer doesn't begin with Ein Kelohenu. We actually also took out the beginning of it. And the beginning of it, in some Sidurim, is an anthology of verses, one from Samuel and 2 from Psalms, which set up this idea that there is none like God. The final verse of that anthology is verse 32 of our psalm. So here's how that anthology goes. Look to God, be strong and of good courage. Oh, look to God. There is no holy one like God. Truly, there is none beside you. There is no rock like our God. And then our verse, truly, who is a God except the eternal? Who is a rock but our God? And then, right, and you can hear it in the Hebrew, Ki mi Eloah mi baladei Adonai umi sur zulati Eloheinu. And then you can hear how you would go right into that to Ein Kelohenu, right? Especially the verse from Samuel, Ein kadosh kadonai ki ein biltecha ve'ein sur Kelohenu. Ein sur Kelohenu sounds very similar to Ein Kelohenu, so it understands why you would introduce that hymn with these verses. So we don't use that verse, but we do the hymn that it was introducing. Verse 38 of our psalm is also quoted in Perek Shirah. So after you got the lightning bolts and the wind and the rain, then you have the fig and the pomegranate and the vine and the apricot, and then the rooster and the hen and the dove and the vulture and the songbird and the swallow and the swift and the stork, right? All the different birds. And then the locust and the fly and the frog and the sheep and the cow and the pig and the camel and the horse. And then you get to the lion and the wolf and the fox and the hound. And then finally, in the middle of chapter 5, you get to the mouse. And the mouse says from Psalm 30, I extol you, O Eternal One, for you have lifted me up and not let my enemies rejoice over me. And then the cat sings a verse from Ovadia. Should you nest as high as the eagle, should your eyrie be lodged among the stars, even from there I will pull you down, declares God. And when the cat catches the mouse, the cat sings from our psalm, I pursued my enemies and overtook them. I did not turn back until I destroyed them. Right? So first the cat is singing, I'm going to get you, O mouse. And then the cat sings, I got you. Right? And then the mouse, according to Perek Shirah, the mouse has the last word. The mouse concedes, right? Surely you are in the right with respect to all that has come upon me, for you have acted faithfully, and I have been wicked. And so the mouse responds to the cat. The cat, clearly in the version of Perek Shirah, the cat is like operating through justice, right? The cat is the pursuer of justice in this version of the cat and mouse. Just a very interesting aspect of Perek Shirah. All right, and then finally, the final verse of our psalm, verse 51, is quoted at the end of Birkat Hamazon, the grace after meals. We talked about how this psalm is word for word 2 Samuel chapter 22. This final verse contains one of the differences between the two versions. Our psalm says, Magdil Yeshuot Malko, according great victories to your king, keeping faith with your anointed, with David and his offspring evermore. But the version in 2 Samuel says instead, Migdol Yeshuot Malko, tower of victory to your king, keeping faith with your anointed, with David and his offspring evermore. So how does our tradition reconcile this difference liturgically in the Birkat Hamazon, the grace after meals? On Shabbat, we use the version from 2 Samuel, Migdol Yeshuot Malko, and on weekdays, we use the version from Psalm 18, Magdil Yeshuot Malko. So if you recite the grace after meals, after every meal that you have bread at, you're going to find yourself saying the verse from Psalm 18 more often, unless you only eat bread on Shabbat. So which do you think is more fitting in the context of the psalm? Tower of victory or according great victories? Probably doesn't matter that much, right? That is to say, both Magdil and Migdol seem to mean very similar things. But given that the opening of the psalm describes God as fortress, right? O Eternal One, my crag, my fortress, my deliverer, my God, my rock, my shield, my champion, my haven. All of those, I think, fit more with the idea of God as a tower. And so maybe that is a better version. Rabbi Richard Levy says, the first question we might ask when reading this psalm is, am I a servant of God? Am I an Eved Adonai? Right? Even before we get to the name of David in the superscription of this psalm, the superscription is to the servant of God. What can we learn from this psalm about how to be a servant of God? And so he says, recognize when there has been a deliverance, offer thanks, lean into the covenantal relationship between God and us. Finally, a servant of God acts enthusiastically in God's service, aware that the power of God is coursing through us. With you, I can race ahead like a legion. With God, I can hurdle a wall. Filled with the energy of God, we too can take on not only human enemies, which are not so many, but the psychological and spiritual enemies of fear, greed, laziness, arrogance, and the rest, which are abundant. I will pursue them, I will overtake them, I will pummel them till they cannot rise. And with gratitude, we too will give thanks to God in public among the nations. We too will sing out to the one who has filled God's servant with majesty, with sovereignty over our own lives, even as God filled our ancestral servant, David. Any other thoughts, reactions, comments? Gary.
I just noticed a curiosity in the little psalm book that I got from the library about the superscription, where they translate, instead of saying being saved from the hands of Saul, it says being saved from the hands of Sheol. And it looks to me like they're spelled exactly the same way. I mean, without the vowels.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah, I want to think about that some more. Nice.
Give us a king just like the nations.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Lovely.
Sheol.
So, all right. Thank you, everybody, for joining for this wonderful discussion of Psalm 18. Next week, we'll do Psalm 19. All right. Take care.
It was good.
Thank you.